Hey everyone, Sam here. Thanks for joining me. I hope you're having a beautiful day wherever you are in the world. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to paint a mountain river, and I'm going to give you some tips on painting water, but also creating atmospheric depth in a landscape painting. Now this particular painting I'm going to show you, it's inspired by an area in Fiordland in southern New Zealand. And if you want to watch a full-length version of this video, then check out my Patreon channel, where each month you get a full-length painting tutorial video plus loads of other content as well, and I've put the link in the description box below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let's get into it. I'm painting on a 12" by 12" linen panel, and this is a medium weave oil primed linen that I've mounted to a craft panel. So I actually first of all bought this linen as just loose linen, and I mounted this to the craft panel myself. Now I'm sketching out the composition here using a mix of burnt sienna and liquid original, and as I'm using oil paint, the liquid original speeds up the drying time, but it also thins the paint as well. Now you could just as easily paint this in acrylics, but I mainly paint in oils. The colours I'm using for this painting include titanium white, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, cadmium red, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue and phthalo green. And this is mainly the palette that I normally use, as you can paint so many different landscapes using these colours. Now the brand of oil paint I'm using are Blue Ridge oils, and they're an artist quality oil paint, absolutely beautiful to use, and I've put a link to the website in the description box below. Now if you've been watching my videos for a while, you'll hear me repeat this in a lot of them, and that is that I paint my dark values and shadows first. I've learnt this mainly through painting outdoors, and I find that painting my shadows and dark values first makes it easier to create atmospheric perspective and add all the areas in afterwards that are in light. So value is how light or dark a subject is, and in general we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground, whereas as landforms recede, especially mountains, darks are not as dark and even lights are not as light. And this is because the value scale in which it's represented, light at one end, dark at the other, is much narrower as we head into the distance. So this is an important rule to remember if you want to paint things such as mountains and make them look like they're far away. So you'll see here I'm painting the cloud shadows and the shadows in the mountains, and it's a mid-tone with a bluish cast, and I've used a mix of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, titanium white and a little alizarin crimson. Now here I've approached the midground and there's a lot of trees, so I've used a mix of ultramarine blue with yellow ochre and a little titanium white just to make the value lighter, so that this mountain sits in the midground. Remember I said I'm saving my darkest darks for the foreground, which will be in the rocks mainly, the occlusion shadows there, and I was pretty much using a near black which I made with ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. So here I'm painting the tree shadows. These are a bit darker, just ultramarine blue and some yellow ochre. And as I say, I'm just painting my dark values and shadows first. I'm using a number 5 flat brush, loose gestural brush marks, as I'm not worried about details in the blocking in stage here. And the brand of brushes I'm using is Rosemary & Co. And these are awesome brushes to use for oil painting. I'm using mainly flat brushes from their classic range, and if you want to get your hands on some Rosemary & Co brushes, I've put a link to their website in the description box below. Now here I'm painting the suggestion of rocks, which are in this part of the painting mostly in shadow, a mix of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, titanium white and a little alizarin crimson, the same colours I've used in those background mountains. So it's actually tying those two zones together, and this way we can create more colour harmony in the painting because there's common elements throughout. And you'll also see those occlusion shadows that I've painted, and that was a mix of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And we can create a near black with these colours because burnt sienna is actually a dark orange, and orange is opposite to blue on the colour wheel, so when they're combined they create a very dark tone. So now I'm painting the elements in the background mountains, so the areas of the rock faces that are in light, again using ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, titanium white and alizarin crimson, but much more burnt sienna in the mix. And then these distant trees, forest in the background, that's a mix of ultramarine blue with some yellow ochre and titanium white, making sure that the value is quite light and that colour is desaturated. We don't want the greens to be too saturated, otherwise it will leap forward in the painting and the mountain won't look like it's in the distance. The sky that I'm painting here is a mix of ultramarine blue with a little phthalo green and titanium white, and skies are some of the lightest values to be found in the landscape. Now I'm working my way forward in the painting, and I'll cover some of the other areas that I'm painting, but I'll mainly for this video just be focusing on the water. But here I'm painting the trees, and what I did was I mixed up a bunch of greens here, much more higher in chroma because we're in the foreground, and it's a mix of yellow ochre with cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue, and then I've also mixed in varying amounts titanium white to adjust the value, rounding off the colour with some cadmium red, which knocks back the green because red is opposite to green on the colour wheel. And I can increase the saturation and shift the hue of the green to some more emerald tones by mixing in some phthalo green. Now as I paint the grass here, I've used the same colours but with much more titanium white in the mix. Grass is generally a much lighter value colour than trees, and trees tend to be some of the darkest values to be found in the landscape, mainly because there's a lot of occlusion shadows in there, especially in conifer trees as well. So I'm moving on to the water, and the water I've kind of divided into three areas. So the background of the water is mainly quite dark because it's reflecting those trees and rocks that are in the background, also that mountainside that's in the midground because there's a lot of vegetation on here. And I've used a mix of yellow ochre with some burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and the value can be adjusted by adding some titanium white. So I've found that this is a nice kind of organic muddy green that you can use for painting things such as rivers. It's actually a really nice organic looking colour. So I'm painting these shadows and reflections of the grass, the trees in the background. And then next I move on to the areas of the water that's reflecting the sky. So this is a mix of ultramarine blue with a little phthalo green and titanium white. But then for some of these other areas I've also mixed in some burnt sienna and a little alizarin crimson. So we've got a greenish blue and a reddish blue in this mix, and I'm applying the paint with a number 5 flat brush. Again, just using loose gestural brush marks at this stage. Now there's some dark areas in the stream here in the foreground where there's some submerged rocks, and that's a mix of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna. And then for this clear area of water in the foreground, I've used a mix of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, titanium white and a little alizarin crimson. Now as I said just a moment ago, I was talking about colour harmony within the painting and how if you're using common colours throughout the painting, it ties all the zones together and it just makes the colours look more harmonious. So you'll see that I've used these colours in the background mountain as well as the stream here, but also the rocks as well. And there's ultramarine blue in most areas of this painting as well, and it's just tying the whole thing together. A painting with good colour harmony will look pleasing to the eye, and whoever's looking at your painting will think, wow, those colours look really nice, and they might not even know why as well, but this is very often the reason, because there's common colours throughout the painting. Now another thing I did with the water in the foreground is painting the suggestion of submerged stones. So the first thing I did was paint the shadows, and this was using my shadow mix, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna and a little alizarin crimson in there. And I'm going to use these to work off so that I can paint the areas of the submerged stones that are in the sunlight. And it just makes the water underneath look like there's loads of stones under there, but you don't have to be too accurate with the shapes because the water kind of distorts the stones anyway, so they're actually not as hard to paint as you'd think. Now following this, I just restate some of the darks here in the painting. I'm trying to get as much information down as I can during the block-in stage so that when it's dry and I begin the modelling and adding detail stage of it, I haven't got so much work to do. So I am trying to get as much information down, but I'm also maintaining that looseness to my brushwork so that even when the painting's done it doesn't look rigid with too much detail. I'm trying to find a balance between both. Just be aware that having too much detail in your painting does run the risk of upsetting the composition, and in general I'd mainly reserve most of your detail for the foreground. As the landforms recede, I tend to go sparingly on the detail just because the human brain fills in the rest of the information, but you also don't want to overcomplicate it on the eye either. Now here I'm adding a few highlights to some of these rocks because in this particular area some of these rocks are bathed in the full sunlight. And this is a mix of mainly titanium white with some burnt sienna and a little yellow ochre, and then also in some of those areas where I want the value to be a bit darker and the colour to be more desaturated, I've mixed in a small amount of ultramarine blue as well. But I'm using a smaller brush here. This is a number 3 filbert brush. It's got a rounded edge and I'm just painting some highlights on some of these rocks. Now again, I just sharpen up some of these shadows within the water beneath the base of some of these stones here, which just emphasises the form of them as well. And then I finish up the blocking in stage by painting in the suggestion of submerged rocks beneath the water in the foreground. This was mainly a mix of burnt sienna with a little ultramarine blue, titanium white and a small amount of alizarin crimson. Now at this stage of the painting here, I let it dry and I was on to my next session, so working on that background mountain, tidying up the shadows and the other elements within it. And then again I was working my way forward in the painting, adding more details to the various zones within it, such as the background mountains, the mountain in the midground, and then I started adding more details to the trees. As I was painting the foliage of the trees, the layers of paint I was adding and the colours, although roughly based around the same colours that I used during the block-in stage, are now starting to get lighter in value, and I'm going to be saving my lightest values until the end of the painting. And this is what will bring everything to life. So as I say, I'm mainly focusing on the river in this video. And I go back to the background of it, adding more shadow areas, and again using the same colours that I was using during the blocking stage. And if you remember, that was a mix of yellow ochre with burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. There's also, in some cases, a little bit of titanium white in there if I need to lighten the value. And I'm actually painting around the negative spaces of some of these stones, which just helps to emphasise the shapes of them. The other thing is I'm trying to make these stones and rocks look as random as possible. And if there's any kind of aberrations or repeating shapes and patterns, I'm trying to eliminate them so that, again, it looks random in the scene and is more pleasing to the eye. Here I'm starting to get into more detail work in the water, and I'm painting the suggestion of ripples and flowing water. I'm using a number 3 filbert brush because the rounded edge of the brush is really good for painting those ripples. Now you'll see here on the right side of the painting that I've got a MAHL fork which I'm resting my arm on, and this is really good if you want to get into more fine detail work. Especially if you've got a bit of a shaky arm or a shaky hand, it just helps to keep your hand more steady. So great for painting things such as ripples here. And MAHL forks are available from a site called mahlfork.com. I'm using the same colours I used during the block-in stage, which is a mixture of ultramarine blue with a little phthalo green and titanium white, but there's a little more titanium white in the mix, so the value is lighter than the previous layer. Once I'd finished with the water, I spent more time adding details to the rocks, adding some lighter highlights on them with a mix of titanium white, burnt sienna and yellow ochre, and mainly focusing the highlights around the midground of this painting. So many of those rocks and stones are still in shadow. It's just going to add interest overall in the painting. Now at this point of the painting I'd worked in a lot of details, and I was working towards the end of it where I'm adding the final details and the highlights. So here I was starting to paint stems and branches within this stand of trees that's in the midground, and I was using the same colours that I was using for the rock highlight. So this was, as I said, titanium white with a little burnt sienna and some yellow ochre, and I was applying the paint with a number 0 synthetic round brush as this achieves much finer marks. I was finishing up the rocks here in the foreground by adding some mid-tones in them, mainly some burnt sienna mix in there, just to add a bit more colour into the rocks, and paint the suggestion of some reflected light as well. Now one of the last details I add to the water is to paint the illusion that some of it is shimmering and sparkling in the full sunlight, and this is a cool little trick you can do with water that just makes it look much more realistic and eye-catching in the painting. So what I'm doing is I'm using a number 0 synthetic round brush and a mix of titanium white with just a dash of yellow ochre which warms up the white. And I'm just literally painting a few dots which are going to appear like sparkles in the water. So this is a nice little trick you can do. And again, I was using my MAHL fork to keep my hand steady as I paint these little dots. So as I said earlier, I save my lightest values until the end of the painting. And overall, as I work through the painting, I keep the value of my colours generally a bit darker so that I've got plenty of room to build up the lighter values as I work through the painting, as I'm adding more details, and then saving my lightest values until the very end. And it's when you add those lightest values that's what makes the painting pop. But anyway, it was around here that I decided to finish the painting and call it a day. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. Now, as I said at the beginning of the video, you can watch a full-length version of this painting tutorial video by subscribing to my Patreon channel for just $5 a month. Each month you get a new full-length painting tutorial video plus access to all the videos that I've recorded over the last 2 years, so it's kind of like a whole landscape painting course. Plus I also publish other content on there, including reference photos, downloadable lesson notes, time-lapse videos of my painting, and other bonus content as well. So all for just $5 a month. The link is in the description box below. Now, if you'd like to learn more about painting landscapes as well as my Patreon channel, there's my website. I've got free painting resources on there, including a painting blog, and there is also a blog to this particular painting as well. I've got full-length painting tutorial videos for sale available on there as well. And if you sign up to my email list, I'm giving away a free ebook on Introduction to Oil Painting. Now, lastly, some of the paintings that are featured in my video, including this one, I've now got available as NFTs, non-fungible tokens, available on crypto.com, and again I've put the link in the description box below. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave me a comment. Thanks for watching, have a beautiful day, and I'll see you in the next video.